Former United States Secretary of State and 2016 Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton commented on President Biden's primetime address about threats to democracy that he gave last week. Let's watch.
I think he did a very important service to the country in giving the speech that he gave, because too many people are not yet aware of how fragile our democracy is. And I'm not going to second guess the language he used because there has been so much that has gone beyond anything I ever would have dreamed of, starting with January 6th. But so many threats of violence and you know, concerns that people are expressing about the country, you know, coming apart and all of that. So I think he did a real service, and I personally thought it was a strong and necessary speech.
So that was in response to a question from Alyssa Farah about whether or not he did a misstep in being overly broad in how he characterized many Trump voters as being part of a fascist movement. What do you make of Hillary's response?
I mean, do you think, even if she thought that was dumb and he shouldn't have said it, is she going to say that on TV? Probably not. So it's like,
well,
who even cares what her?
Isn't that part of the problem?
Yeah, she's not going to say anything real. I mean, she's still a team player, and for Biden at least.
But why? Like, this is what's so frustrating to many people, that even at the end of your political career, even when she just also news this week was that she said she was never going to run for president again. Even when you're completely taking yourself out of the political.
Uncork the champagne at that.
Pops were heard around the world. No, like. It's frustrating for leftists as well to look at Bernie and say, okay, you're done. Like, you're not running for president again. You know, you're safe in your seat. At what point is the excuse of saving your political capital for something else going to stop being a legitimate justification for not saying the truth?
I mean, it's also believable, though, that she thinks that was an entirely correct way to characterize people, because if anything, Biden learned it from her. It's how she characterized people. It's how she characterized people, and it was, you know, widely believed to be one of her major political missteps during the campaign, but she can never concede having made a political misstep. Has she admitted that maybe she should have visited Michigan or Pennsylvania?
No, that's Bernie's fault somehow.
It's Bernie's fault.
Like, Jill Stein's.
It's Russia. It's you know, the excuses just pour in.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry. So like what she has to say about this, she has no expertise at all.
Yeah, I will say props for asking the question, because if you watch that part of the interview, you know, she's given Farah dagger eyes the whole time. She's asking, and it is frustrating because, look, I have seen other politicians do a mea culpa. In fact, my radar was on Stacey Abrams. She had a moment earlier in the campaign cycle where a kind of a fiery, worked up speech she was giving in front of a crowd was contextualized as Republicans as her saying that she didn't think that Georgia was a good place to live. She said something like, you know, these stats about maternal mortality and stuff are really bad, and, you know, the state should be better. And I saw her in an interview, I think with Joyanne Reid actually, where she acknowledged, look, I should have phrased that differently. I shouldn't have said that. Obviously, I love Georgia because, you know, I was living elsewhere. I grew up actually in Mississippi. I came here because I chose Georgia as a place I want to live. And she just
Can you imagine Hillary Clinton doing that? You can't, because she never would. She would never apologize to the American people. She thinks the American people should apologize to her.
Right.
That's how she feels about it.
And that is her fundamental flaw. I would argue that is, in fact, why she's not president of the United States. Because when she was getting legitimate good faith criticisms from the left and others, and the right, frankly, some of the criticism that the right was making, she really was a Wall Street shill. She really did spend all her time getting paid exorbitant amounts of money for these speeches and things like that. You know, she does have a record to have to defend and excuse and apologize for from the 90s with her.
She's one of the foremost philosophical advocates of war throughout her Senate tenure, and her Secretary of State
was his worst
mistake. It was one of his biggest mistakes, certainly his biggest foreign policy mistake, and she was the architect of it.
And instead of internalizing those critiques and pivoting and apologizing in a world that I think was open to it because the alternative was Donald Trump, she refused. She said, it's my turn, and that's why she's sitting as a host on The View, or as a guest on The View, instead of in the Oval Office right now.
Well, she also had this to say about accusatory language on both the left and the right.
Fascism is a very big word. I know that. But so is socialism, and the Republicans call every Democrat who wants people to have health care a socialist. So I think we do need to be careful with our language, but I think the problem is if you go through the hallmarks of authoritarian regimes, you see too many characteristics, unfortunately, on our Republican side. And my most fervent hope is that Republicans themselves will begin to reject all of that verbally, vocally in their voting, and kind of reconstitute the Republican Party to where it used to be, and not the party of Trump.
I do think this was actually fair criticism from her because, and I saw Mehdi Hassan, who you like so much, he did have a pretty funny clip of like, Republicans so outraged that they would get called fascists, and then it was just a clip of so many Republican pundits and politicians calling Democrats fascists.
Correct.
And her point that, the socialist word is thrown to people who actually deserve it to her. You would be offended that she who self-identify as democratic socialists.
Proudly, yes.
And they're outraged that anyone would dare call Hillary Clinton a socialist, I'm sure.
I'm also outraged.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Exactly, yeah.
But and I agree with that criticism, and I have long warned that if you the Republican tendency to call everything socialist is dumb because
the boy who cried wolf.
Well, and also they're calling things that sometimes are broadly popular socialists, so then people will think that an economic system based on a one-party system and state suppression is a good idea because you've described it as socialism.
Well, there should be a better conversation that gets had. We had a little bit yesterday with Nathan Robinson about authoritarian socialism and how authoritarianism can rear its head in any context, including capitalism, which is the context that we're all obviously talking about it here right now. But
reared its head in socialism a lot historically, but we'll.
It's reared its head a lot more in capitalism because most countries are capitalism, and any bad thing that's happening in the right world, you can attribute to it being in a capitalist context because we basically snuffed out every socialist country on the face of the earth. But that this is something that Robby and I can go on about for a very long time. So we will move on and have
our
more. Our
producers do not want us to have a socialism capitalism debate right now.
We'll be back after this.